Hello. So, welcome to Lam Rim again. Before we start, let's do our best to set our motivation just for the session to think about how the benefit of enlightenment for us is that it helps us to fulfill the needs of all beings. Therefore, for us to continue to work towards our path, treading our path, is a benefit to not just ourselves but to everybody. There are many benefits, and we ourselves would be free from suffering or misery, or the potential of suffering or misery. And likewise, we are able to continue to benefit those around us effortlessly. So, how to do that? We learn from our teachers and from the Buddha, the various different aspects of the path, and understand how each part is essential to our development. And within that, we learn the sixth perfection is that of insight or wisdom. And so we are currently working to do that, to learn and to establish in our mind stream, this insight that will help to free us from our own ignorance that's keeping us bound to suffering, the cycle of suffering known as samsara. So that's what we're working on, and therefore, while we're taking part or engaged in anything we're doing, it's good for us to consider and to think and to use this opportunity to work to develop. And I've said before, I might not be right, or I might not be right for you, but it still provides an opportunity to use our discriminating awareness, our critical thinking, to identify within ourselves a mind which is liberated. So up until now, we're now on chapter 13, up until now, Rinpoche has been primarily providing us with the basic elements, the primary areas leading us into understanding the middle way school, the Madhyamaka, which is his chosen method for delivering our understanding of emptiness or selflessness. So the way in which he's done that is, he said, he's not saying that other paths are not available to us, but it's best for us to use one tried and trusted methodology. The Madhyamaka has been around for over 2,000 years now, and it provides us with a great ability for us to see precisely, to see clearly. And in order to do that, he's essentially helped us understand some of the limits specific to the middle way school, the middle way tradition, such as the fact that that there is no conflict between emptiness and karma. And in fact, karma and emptiness belong to the same, depend upon each other. So there's this aspect of dependent arising, how everything depends upon the environment and causes and circumstances to arise. And the point within the middle way school is that it's this dependent arising, this foam of change, of cause and consequence, which from which things arise, which demonstrates emptiness, selflessness. And this is a unique quality found in the middle way school. So first of all is to recognize what it is we're getting rid of, and not to make a mistake about the fact that we're not getting rid of existence. What we're trying to do is to get rid of this idea of inherent existence, which is what allows for us to bind ourselves into a suffering or a toxic relationship. And the reason why it's often called selflessness is it's this sense of soul or entityhood that we carry, that is sort of like a ghost that is quite a toxic relationship for ourselves. So this is why it's called selflessness. But it's not extended just to ourselves. It's also the same quality. This nature reaches out towards the way in which we see things. Primarily, the point is to say that things are not inherently, they don't inherently exist. So inherently means on their side. So it doesn't exist on its own side, on its own way. So this is an important aspect. And then beyond that, we have looked primarily at recognizing that when we do analysis work, when we're trying to find the, and in fact, indeed find the absence of this essence or this inherent existence on this side, that this analysis doesn't get rid of the object itself in terms of its mere existence. Just like if I recognize the lack of entityhood within the cup on its side, the cup doesn't cease to be. And so this is an important point, that we're not eliminating or turning everything into fictions. But what is a fiction is the idea that they exist on their own side independently. So the way in which we see this initially is, it seems to be an inner conflict, because we find our idea of existence is so wrapped up in the idea of things existing independently on their own, that we tend to jump between existence and non-existence as being the only two extremes. And the point here is that actually the very nature of inherent existence and inherent non-existence is not present. So it's that aspect that we're particularly looking at. So that was the aspect to do with rational analysis. And then also, not only that, we looked at, as I said, the dependent arising nature, as well as not misidentifying the object of our analysis, which is its mere existence. And now Rinpoche wants to move on to valid establishment. Primarily, this is, again, it's sort of going to cover some bases about how we're not going to be able to use valid cognition, or the ability for us to perceive things, as the basis to destroy the existence of objects, even though we will see that through reasoning, which comes later on, that our valid perception does not perceive this essential, this inherent, or this intrinsic existence that is denied. So when it comes to the words we're using here, one of the words that's being used a lot here is valid cognition. Valid cognition is a traditional Buddhist term, and it's really to do with the idea of a sort of a valid perception, or a correct perception of an object. Whereas while there is within modern psychology some distinction to be made about how a sense, like our eye, picks up an object from the mere sensory input, and it goes through a chain of various different, or if you like, a web of various different aspects of our brain, in order to then derive into something that then affects us in terms of making a decision. But along that process, there's a large amount of the sort of intermediary processing going on, if you like, such as identifying objects like targets, or things, or dangers or risks, in between the sense a perception of it, to the mere sense perception from our retina, to the time that which is like a very, very short amount of time, the time before it becomes it is brought to our attention by our mind. So this is not dissimilar to the idea, some of the ideas that are going to be discussed about the idea of a sense consciousness, so such as the visual sense consciousness, which is a Buddhist idea, in terms of the entire cognitive path being that is sense related, so or sense bound or sense derived, so I sense derived as being a sense consciousness. So it doesn't, or while we might say, oh, this is a rather medieval sort of simple way of dealing with how actually our mind develops our inputs. In fact, we don't need to get involved too much in the metaphysics or the psychology or the biology of the sense consciousness. What we're looking at is the pathway, the approach to it. And the point is going to be made that essentially before we get to the central cortex, the sort of the central mental processes, we have already attached some sort of ignorant bias towards the way in which we see things. In other words, even these low-level consciousness sort of pathways are invested in some sort of marker of inherent existence. So this is where we can say, for instance, that it's not our ignorance in terms of the way in which we see it, in terms of where Buddhism sees it, is not limited to humans or to language or to conceptual thought, because all of these things belong to mental consciousness, and certainly within the scope of the Middle Way school, even the large underpinnings, the processes that develop sort of our perceptions through senses, are also bound in the same way. So one of the aspects again is there going to be some accusations that, or if you like, some ideas that people have come up with when trying to identify the Middle Way school, and this includes Middle Way authors themselves. So Rinpoche says is when we talk about forms and so on, forms being the objects of a mental, of an I consciousness, we do not hold that valid cognition, this is a valid perception of this cup, I have a valid perception of this cup. We don't say that my valid perception does not establish it. In fact, valid cognition by definition, this is I have a correct perception within reason of this cup. I say within reason because, of course, I'm augmenting my vision with glasses and so on in order to get a clearer picture. But the way in which I see it is more or less the way that it is, bar this intrinsic existence. And so then the question arises, I think I've slightly preempted this, within Chandrakirti saying in the commentary on the Middle Way, how he says, and Chandrakirti, remember, is one of our key figures here, key teachers. What does he mean when he says the world is not valid in any way? And Rinpoche responds saying this here refutes any idea that we might have that the visual consciousnesses and so on are valid with regard to reality. So this is the point. It does not refute their validity regarding all objects. So the world is not valid in any way is in terms of the way in which we might perceive inherent or intrinsic existence naturally, absolutely naturally, biologically, but it's not present. But it doesn't refute, and Rinpoche says, it doesn't refute their validity regarding all objects or their mere existence, just merely this intrinsic reality. So one of the aspects of this, again, and I was sort of, forgive me if I'm repeating myself a lot, but one of the aspects of this, again, is there's no deep metaphysical investment in the Middle Way school. It's not as if there's a particular strong conviction about the way we are or the way we live or the way our mind works or anything like that at all. It's just primarily this one aspect to do with the way in which we misperceive a quality, we inhere a quality into objects which is not present, that it just we imagine that it is present. So this is really the only boundary within which the middle way school establishes anything, whereas other schools such as the Yogacarya, the Chitta Martyrs, they talk about the mind basis of all, or so on. So this involve philosophical assertions about the way in which things actually are, and the middle way school doesn't do that. Well, we'll see. So Chandrakirti explains this position in terms of perceptions. He says if we had a valid perception of, if we had a truly valid, ultimately, finally valid, completely valid perception of this cup, then we would be the same. We would see the cup in the same way that a Buddha does, and we do not. Otherwise, if we were able to see the world as it truly is, then we would be enlightened, and we would be free of ignorance, and therefore would be free of samsara within the Buddhist context, and we are not. So if this were the case, we wouldn't really have any need to do any work, and we would have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be enlightened at all? And he uses the words noble, and why would one enter into the Buddhist path? Why would one bother? So in this sense, we have to recognize that there is something about what we are looking at that is distinctly different from that of an enlightened being, and the way in which we perceive things is clearly not the same way as an enlightened being does. We have to train ourselves to learn how to do that. We have to train ourselves to do that in an experiential way. This isn't a philosophical discussion. This is about how to change our mind to see the world in a way which is less toxic for us and for everyone else. So again, and Rinpoche continues, he says, because if our visual consciousness, our mere visual consciousness, were able to a certain reality, it would be fruitless for us to work at ethics or to study or reflect or meditate in order to understand the path, because, and he doesn't say this, but the implication being because we would already have it available to us. However, this is not the case. And he says, therefore, this is why I say, because the world is not valid in any way, the world has no critique in the context of reality. And then again, Rinpoche, taking from Chandrakirti himself, commentary on the Nagarjuna 60 verses, to view forms as simply existing is not to see reality. So to see them just simply arising is not to see reality. And in this sense, in order to recognize that the way in which we to see them naturally is not correct, and it's because of that Buddha said the eye, the ear, the nose are not valid cognitions. So Rinpoche is making the point here that while Buddha does say in some sutras the eye, the ear, the nose are not valid cognitions, we within the middle way school we have a slightly different emphasis in terms of recognizing that indeed they are valid cognitions, as long as we're not talking about it within terms of final nature, in terms of the ultimate nature, or in terms of the intrinsic existence. In this way they are not valid. So there's a distinction to be made between validly recognizing the mere cup that we have in our conventional world, the story of the cup and so on, the way in which we talk about the cup, give me the cup, and having a cup for a birthday present and so on. This is all completely fine, and it revolves around valid perception or valid cognition or valid establishment, but it's not valid in terms of the way in which we imbue or cast or color everything with this sort of grimy layer of thingness, where we begin to create the idea in our minds, an illusory idea that the way in which we see the world is the one way in which things are. So when we begin to recognize that things, that there is no one way in which things are, then we begin to lose some of the investment in terms of how we relate to them. So this is something I had talked about before, but also this because, and why I say it, although it's not explicit here, is that if there were intrinsic existence available, then that would determine that there was one way in which things were. If there is more than the way in which things are, then we can't establish intrinsic existence. Because it would mean that in its own light, it would exist in a particular way or mode that is that therefore defines its relationship within the universe, and therefore we would only be having the single narrative, the single story of how the universe is. So here, and Rinpoche is saying, and let's be clear, Chandrakirti is citing the sutra, and it's clear that what he's refuting is that visual consciousness is not valid regarding the one special object, which is this sort of reality. Not that they're invalid regarding other objects such as a mere cup. And Rinpoche hammers the point home, saying, therefore, if we don't accept it this way, if we're trying to find another way in which we read this, interpret this, then we would end up considering that Chandrakirti was being inconsistent, and that doesn't really make it much sense. So in terms of doing this, he says that if we think that what he was doing was being incoherent in terms of the way in which he was talking about validity of our visual consciousness. So it says, if it were valid regarding conventional objects or normal objects such as forms and sounds, then it would follow that there's no need to strive at the path in order to perceive reality. So this is the idea. This is not what he says. This is what it would appear that he says if we don't recognize this interpretation about how he's talking about these two ways. So and this is absurd, because he's saying essentially, if our visual consciousness is valid regarding forms, then it's valid regarding everything. Therefore, we don't need to become enlightened. On the other hand, if we take the other alternative, the alternative interpretation, which is if visual consciousness was valid with regard to forms, then it would absurdly follow that it's pointless to strive at the path in order to perceive things such as forms. And we agree with that. And the reason why is because what we're saying is that if the path was only concerned with the forms or the objects of these things, then we have no need for the path. We can see this. I can see that's a cup easily enough. Thank you very much. So, so the point is here is we have to actually recognize specifically what it is where the difference is. Again. So then another thing that we might consider is to think about another commentary made by Chandrakirti, again on the 400 verses. This is R.A. Davis. It's all of the major teachers here. He says it's inconsistent to call sensory consciousness perception and also to consider it valid with regard to other things. As the world sees it, a valid cognition is simply a non-deceptive consciousness. Okay, so this means the valid cognition, the way we see this, is saying we're not deceived about the fact that this is a cup. However, Buddha in Sutra has said that even consciousness, because it is composite, has a false and deceptive quality and is like a magician's illusion. So that which has a false and deceptive quality is not non-deceptive because it exists in one way and appears in another. It's not right to designate such a valid cognition because it would then absurdly follow that all consciousness would be valid cognitions. So the question is, well, this is what Chandrakirti wrote. How do you respond to that? How do you interpret this general refutation of the position of visual consciousness? And Rinpoche says this is different from saying eye, ear, nose are not valid. This is a different point, and I'll explain it in detail. So he says, first of all, we need to recognize the sort of mind that this sort of argument is being used against. In other words, it's specifically for what here he calls his logicians. Now, this logicians is sort of an old Buddhist school of thought. It doesn't mean anybody who calls themselves a logician. So he says we need to, in order to understand what Chandrakirti is saying here, we also need to understand the context within which he's saying this in terms of his understanding of what the logicians are saying. And Chandrakirti says that we need to, when we're talking to logicians, we need to question them very closely. And in addition, again, this is like, again, a way of thinking about our own minds. It's not like when we're talking to somebody else. It's when we see this aspect within our own mind. In fact, this is not too unusual for a sort of a Western approach. So what is a perception? Well, there's a good question for us to ask ourselves. What do I mean when I say I perceive something? Yeah. And so an answer could be, well, a consciousness is a perception. A consciousness is my perception there. Well, and so then it's like saying, and this is where we're looking into a spiritual case. Well, what sort of consciousness has a valid perception? So we're talking about valid perception here, and they're saying, well, this is like an enlightened consciousness. So they say one that's free from conceptuality. And you say, well, what is this conceptuality? And it's this fluctuation of discrimination that is involved in the superimposition of names and types to objects. You know, it's the language layer that we stick on. It's the conceptual sort of overcovering that prevents us from seeing things as they really are. But when we are free of this, then the five consciousnesses, the five being the different senses, engage in the inexpressible direct character of their objects, and therefore they're called perceptions, valid perceptions. So from this point of view, we have to recognize that this position, if you like, the logician position, is that a perception is a consciousness free from, or valid perception, free from conceptuality, and is non-mistaken. And it's non-mistaken in that it apprehends the intrinsic character of the object just as it is, right? So it sees the intrinsic nature of the object just as it is. And therefore, from this position, all five sensory perceptions comprehend the intrinsic character of the objects. And so the intrinsic characteristic of the form, the intrinsic characteristic of the sounds and taste and touch and so on. It's and Rinpoche is saying that essentially because of this, from their own viewpoint, or from this viewpoint, then it's it's in relationship with this intrinsic character that we can identify that such perceptions are valid. As we have already mentioned, and how we will go into more detail later on too, Chandrakirti, in fact, the middle way school doesn't accept any, even conventionally, that anything exists essentially or by way of any intrinsic character. Therefore, he can't accept any claim that the sensory consciousness are valid with regard to the intrinsic character of the objects, because within our or within the middle way school, the idea that there is an intrinsic character is out of the water. It's not found, it's not present. Therefore, we can't then say, well, perception depends upon this relationship with the intrinsic character, because this is a relationship with a non-thing. So therefore, the original query is based on the idea of saying that this refutation, the refuting the basis that they're valid is on the basis that they're valid in relation to the intrinsic character of the five objects of the five senses. Now, the way in which is done this is by using the statement by Buddha in many sutras that the consciousness is false and deceptive. And the idea that's saying that it's deceptive says prevents it from being non-deceptive. And this itself then refutes its validity, because that which is non-deceptive is the definition of valid cognition. So valid cognition means something that's valid, therefore it's something that's non-deceptive. So in which way is it deceptive? And Chandrakirti says it again, it exists in one way but it appears in another. This means that the five objects of our senses are not established by the way of their intrinsic character, but appear to the sensory consciousnesses as if they were. And because of that, sensory consciousnesses are not valid with regard to the intrinsic character of their objects. It can't be, because there is no intrinsic character. So what does that mean? It means that essentially what we see does not depend upon a particular characteristic or nature of the objects of our sight. And you say, well, actually, hang on, Ben. If the cup wasn't material, then I wouldn't be able to see it, and so on. If there was no light in the room, that's absolutely fine, because it doesn't establish intrinsic nature. What it establishes is an interdependent relationship. And the point about intrinsic is it's something to do with what's over here on its own, not necessarily something to do with the interdependent relationship of everything. So the fact that they appear to look one way, even to our sense consciousnesses, but are something else, is why, in a sense, we have to say that that there's this deceptive nature to our perceptions. So another point of view, and this is something that we struggle with when we're learning or to develop an understanding, is saying, well, if it doesn't exist on its own, if it doesn't exist here, I mean, quite clearly there's a mug here, and it doesn't depend upon me to look at it for it to, when I close my eyes, it's not as if it vanishes. I can feel it, it has presence. So an essentialist point of view is saying that if it didn't exist on its own, on its side, then it wouldn't be a thing, it wouldn't be present at all. Something that doesn't exist on its own side is like the elephant in my hand, right? none of us can see. The invisible elephant in my hand. It's a small one, yeah? So they say if there is no intrinsic existence, then they're not established at all. And this position is basically, we say that if this doesn't have some sort of intrinsic existence in terms of its appearance to me, then it's not available for my eye consciousness. It's just not available to me, and it's only because of it having some sort of intrinsic existence here that my sensory consciousness can validate that and therefore provide a valid cognition. So again, and this is following Chandrakirti, is saying if something were established by the way of its intrinsic character or its essence or its inherent nature, or it would be something true. It would be something objectively true. It would exist. It would be true in the universe for all beings and for everybody at all times. So a valid cognition that posited such a truly existent object would have to be valid regarding the object's intrinsic character. So what he's saying is that if it were true, then for us to have it, we'd have to be able to have this valid, and then we could establish, if you like, this based on that. However, because objects are false, the valid cognition that posits them does not have to be valid regarding their intrinsic nature. Because we don't accept there is an intrinsic nature here, but we can accept the object, we can then say that it's clear that our valid cognition does not depend upon this intrinsic nature. Inherent, intrinsic, same thing. Inherent is like in here, intrinsic, on its side, within itself. That's all it means. So I'm not from a philosophical background, so for me these words are quite hard to keep in my mind what they mean. So I repeat them a lot, but some people who've had some training, then they're more familiar with it. But we don't need to train in philosophy to understand this. This is really important. It can help in terms of understanding some of the language, but essentially what we need to do is to remove the quality, this one thing. So it's not really necessary for us to develop a huge background in philosophical understanding, because all we need to do is to deal with one specific thing, and that one thing is all we need in terms of our practice. And also we need to make it experiential. So it's not about terminology, it's not about being able to speak it, except when we're sharing, but primarily it's about being able to recognize correctly what it is that we need to develop an understanding of. So here Rinpoche then cites more Chandrakirti again. He says it's not reasonable that our normal perception should cancel perception of reality. So just because our normal perception of reality of the world, such as this being a cup, it shouldn't and cannot have any ability to say that because I can see a cup here, then that's the basic truth, and there's no further reality available. Yeah. He said, we can talk about it as saying it's valid for the world. It makes sense for us to talk about the world. And in terms of the way in which we relate to things and talk about context of things, it's absolutely relevant for us to use that language. but because we recognize that in fact there is this deceptive quality, they appear to have some intrinsic existence that they do not. This is the deceptive quality. Then we can say that in a sense they are sort of false. They're not quite what they are. So this is going back to asking the question about the logicians and saying the position that sensory consciousness are valid regarding their intrinsic character. He says that while we're refuting the idea that that's a truth, that objects we're denying, we're saying that we can demonstrate that that it's only in terms of recognizing the intrinsic character that we can actually talk about a valid consciousness. Because that's what we're talking about. He's not having to refute the fact that they're just simply valid cognitions. They're valid in terms of the normal worldly world, the normal language. Worldly world. And therefore, and it's important that Chandrakirti is not giving a general refutation of the position that, so he's not refuting that there are valid cognitions within a normal world, within the conventional world that we live in. We can easily talk about saying, yeah, there's a cup here, and if and that's a valid cognition. And if I say, oh yes, and there's an invisible elephant here, there's not a valid cognition because there isn't. I mean, we like to imagine it and we can play with it, but in the end, there is no baby elephant. There's no baby elephant on my hand. So therefore, if I'm perceiving one, then you know, like, oh, it's smiling at me, then this sort of is fun for playing, right? And it's fine. But then we also have to say that if I really perceive it, then this is an invalid cognition. Oh, it's just fallen. So then there's something about, in terms of looking at types of valid cognition, and this again comes to current analytical sort of psychology, I mean contemporary and sort of 9th century India, in terms of how to identify direct or inferential or other means, logical ways of establishing a valid cognition. In other words, we don't need to see it to know that it's true and to be correct. But essentially, this primarily is something that it doesn't belong to the Middle Way school itself. It's adopted according to the current environment. So therefore, and again, hammering home again and again, what we're saying is a refutation, we're denying anything that involves essential existence, both in terms of the nature of the cognition, or the objects of comprehension, the objects of cognition, or the fact that the idea that cognition depends upon a nature of some sort of essential existence. All of this is denied, is rejected. However, there's no rejection regarding the idea that we can have a valid cognition or an object of comprehension, or you know, an object to our cognition as well as a subject or a mental cognition, as long as all of that is recognized as a dependent arising, which is what I was saying earlier on. These things, says Prasnapada, again, clear words by Chandrakirti, these things are all established through mutual dependence. When valid cognitions exist, then there are things which are the objects of those comprehension. When there are things that are the objects of comprehension, then there are valid cognitions. However, neither of these, neither the cognitions nor the objects of comprehension, the objects that are being identified within this valid cognition, none of these inherently exist by their own nature. Therefore, says Rinpoche, and let's be clear, as long as we don't have an eye disease or some sort of internal mental, internal means mental or physical in terms of our body, or an external cause of error, then when we perceive something, it's accurate in conventional terms. If I'm not hallucinating, I don't have an eye disease, and I see a blue and white cup, I'm seeing a blue and white cup, and it's correct. It's a valid perception. However, it's mistaken in terms of its appearance, because due to my ignorance, it appears as if it's intrinsically existent. So the way in which it appears in terms of this one thing, this intrinsic or this inherent existence, this part of that perception is invalid, is mistaken. And this is the mistaken appearance. But the rest of the cognition in terms of the perception or whatever, this is absolutely fine. It's completely valid. And so again, and Rinpoche is citing a lot from Chandrakirti again, and he says this is found within Chandrakirti's text. He says, look, we have all the things that we normally see in the world. These are the objects known by the world, and when we see them and we're able to say, if we've got the blue cup, we'll be able to perceive it, we'll know which one we're talking about, we'll be able to relate to it. And this is why we have unimpaired sensory faculties, with a mind that's not filled with some form of delusion or drug or whatever it is that would otherwise create hallucinations. And the rest of it, it says, is posited as unreal for the world. So if I say, would you pass me over your little elephant? It's like, we can do it. I said at play, right? But in the end, it's not real for the world. Therefore, we can establish, and this is the point, we can establish what's real and what's unreal without having to be concerned in terms of the normal convention, right? Conventions themselves, or whatever conventions we have complete ability to accept and reject entities and things within those conventions. So within that sense, it's like we can recognize even within the context of specific context, we can recognize that there's a different level of relationship to different objects. So those sorts of things shows us that, and we talked before about the idea of a convention that's based in physics, or a convention that's based in chemistry, or a convention that's based in law. And all of these are like context. It can provide huge amounts of beneficial structure for our society. But the point is being made here is that none of them are necessarily more real than anything else. We will use whichever convention is most suitable to the time being. And because we are able to do that, it demonstrates that there is no one underlying truth available to us. We're just looking at things from a different point of view to fit the specific need at hand. So he says, therefore, conventional consciousnesses and their objects are of two types: those which are accurate, valid cognitions, and those which are inaccurate. So then there's a list of all the different ways in which we can have inaccurate sensory faculties, such as eye disease, as is primarily talking about eye consciousness. But the idea is we can extend that to any of the others, any other senses. Jaundice, which gives a yellow cast, and so forth, as well as eating datura, which is a powerful and poisonous hallucinogen. So all of these empower our sensory faculties. Just again, external conditions, these are the internal ones, external conditions that impair faculties are like water and mirrors, sounds spoken from within a cave, echoes, as well as sunlight in certain times and places, which create mirages. Mirrors. So what makes them impair the sensory faculties is that they cause the apprehension of reflections or echoes or whatever. These environments create these illusory aspects, which are merely reflections of or distortions of light in a way that makes us confused about what's present there. So it's not as if the echo is any less unreal. In fact, Rinpoche is going to go on about this in a bit. But an echo itself is just as real as the voice that caused it, and such as is the reflection in the mirror is just as real a reflection as the face that it's a reflection of. But if we're we've talked about this before, but sometimes we might see a reflection and not recognize that it's a reflection, and at that point it's false. We might hear an echo and think that it's somebody calling. At that point it's false. So it's the aspect of when there is a misapprehension of it being something there when it isn't, that we're really using these analogies. It's not to be imagined that there's some sort of special case for reflection having a different type of existence than the object it's reflecting. It's the same. It's still exactly the same. It's a dependent arising with no intrinsic existence. But when we perceive it, like another one is a snake in the grass. If we see a rope and we think it's a snake, we're like, oh, a snake, and there's like, oh, it's only a rope. So that moment is there. There's a misperception. So this is a false perception. This is what we're talking about here, is invalid perception. And he says there's also cases with sometimes some medicines, we have side effects which are very strong, and sometimes there are conjurers or magicians, and what they make they appear to make a woman cut in half, and then they put her back together again, and so on. So this sort of illusion is gives us a perception which is false, a false perception. It's quite entertaining. So also then there are other ways in which we can have a false perception, such as false reasoning, for instance, conflating things together, jumping and making, following cognitive bias, where false presumptions, all sorts of different ways in which we might have strong beliefs that prevent us from seeing clearly what's going on. But like when I was very little, I remember when the noise of the toilet in our house was very loud when I flushed it, and it seemed too noisy to be just a simple toilet, that the water coming down there. So I imagined that there was I thought that there was some sort of creature there that was growling, and so whenever the toilet monster was, I knew that it would come when I pulled the chain, so I always backed out. So this sort of aspect is just a 4-year-old mind of a 4 or 5-year-old. This is sort of a simple thing. It didn't take long to recognize. It's just flushed. It doesn't do anything, but that sort of cognitive appropriation of the noise being some sort of danger to me was obviously a misperception, and not an invalid perception. So we can say, therefore, that false reasoning and likewise bad tenets or mistaken philosophical, religious, political beliefs can also cause us all sorts of problems. And then also conditions such as sleep degrade our consciousness in terms of associated with the dreams. Things appear to be what they aren't, and so on. So he says, within this context, when we're talking about perception, and we've gone into quite a lot of detail about all the different ways in which we perceive things or what can impair our perception, one of the things that's not mentioned is our base ignorance in terms of the ignorance related to intrinsic existence. He says this is not part of it. And why is it not? Because this is not something that's easily recognized within a normal contextual environment. So all of these other things are common. Everybody knows them, or can recognize that these sorts of things happen. But it's when we actually we can talk about it and we can sort of say, oh well, but I'm Buddhist, so I think ignorance is the cause of all suffering and so on. And it's like, well, what does that mean? So well, Buddha says it in his sutras. Yeah, but what's it mean? Well, Buddha says it in his sutras, so yeah. It means that it's toxic to be ignorant. Well, ignorant of what? Selfless. What's self? So these sort of things, like saying, okay, well, this is what we're learning right now. Self is intrinsic existence. Oh, so not just the yourself. No, no, no. So then there's a discussion which is saying, well, you talk about all the various different things like the mug and so on, the qualities of the mug and the aspects of the mug and how this work and so on, and yet as if they exist within the context of various different conventions, but you're not saying anything about then why then surely intrinsic character exists conventionally, right? Its intrinsic inherent nature exists conventionally. After all, this is how we all perceive things all the time. However, we don't, but Chandrakirti doesn't say that. He says quite the opposite. He says that intrinsic existence does not exist even conventionally. So then there's then Rinpoche is going to okay, we've got a few pages on this. So on this question, primarily in terms of another one of the great teachers on the middle way school, Bhavaviveka. And he says, well, this is actually what Bhavaviveka says. He says that conventional, that intrinsic existence does exist conventionally. And that conventions have it that things exist by way of their intrinsic character. And the Chittamatrins, or the mind-only school, the Yogacarya, also say that that if something imaginary, like the little elephant, it doesn't exist because there is no intrinsic nature there. There's an absence of any intrinsic little miniature elephant on the hand. Therefore, one of the aspects of the Yogacarya is that there's the intrinsic nature does exist as the basis for establishing non-imaginary constructs. In other words, objects, things. Sometimes the logic of non gets a bit confusing, and it's not necessary. It's just my mind. But so yeah, in the terms of what we're saying here is that essentially sometimes we find even within the middle way school, some teachers have established the basis of there being an intrinsic nature. Now let's cut to the chase. By now, the message should be clear that within the central line of the middle way school, and essentially from Rinpoche's point of view, certainly from Chandrakirti's point of view, that's not the case. There is no intrinsic nature anywhere, not even in conventional truth. So in order to demonstrate that when Bhavaviveka is talking to the Chittamatrians, now this is a bit more subtle than possibly Rinpoche gives him credit for. Bhavaviveka is actually trying to have an argument with the Yogacarya school about the way in which they're seeing it. He says that if they assert that the minds that construct those entities and features, the entities, lack intrinsic character conventionally, then they're denying the existence of contingent entities. There's a bit of a mouthful here. So there's so what he's saying here is that within the argument against the Chittamatriya, or the Yogacarya, it's easier for me to say, that essentially their ability to talk about non-existent things as being non-existent because of a lack of intrinsic existent nature, he's saying, well, you need to be careful because now you've established that those things that if you have it that the mind that actually is making that construction doesn't have intrinsic nature, you've wiped out the mind. Now Rinpoche's argument here is therefore Bhavaviveka is establishing that he considers that contingent is, in other words, for just normal, or worldly, or conventional, or contextual. So he's saying in this sense that these entities have, he says that Bhavaviveka says these do have this quality. Now, I would argue the case of saying, well, maybe Bhavaviveka is using this argument solely for the purpose to demonstrate a fault in the Yogacarya. It doesn't necessarily establish that that's his belief, but I'll put that to one side. However, so maybe I'm wrong here, because again, Bhavaviveka says in another commentary on Nagarjuna, he says, if you say the nature of a construct, the mental, so the expression of form, if you say that the nature of the nature of a form does not exist, then you're denying things because you're denying the mental and verbal expressions that such and such exist. So this, following this a bit more clearly, and then again Rinpoche uses another teacher who's critiquing Bhavaviveka called Avalokiteshvara. He says that essentially when we look at this, we have to be very careful that the way in which this argument is constructed, especially in terms of this mistaking of denial, is that the character in the phrase lacking characteristic nature is really just referring to intrinsic or inherent nature. So Chittamatrians assert that imputations do not have that, but that contingent entities, constructed entities do, and therefore they exist intrinsically. And this is because contingent entities are primarily things that arise. They arise and fall. They're caused. It means dependent arising in this sense. And therefore they say that they don't have that because they arise from other things. Contingent entities don't have this self nature. They lack nature. They lack this inherent nature. So this is, for me personally, I'm trying to understand the Yogacarya arguments very, very complicated because of it uses a large amount of the Yogacarya understanding the world, which has not been a part of my practice. And then again, so what we're talking about here is Avalokitavrata commenting on Bhavaviveka, who's trying to dispute with Yogacharya about how something that appears to be imaginary, whether or not it exists. And at this point, then maybe it's a good idea for us to study this ourselves, but because I feel that the point is becoming quite a convoluted one. However, one of the aspects of this is to say that there's the text called the Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning, and this is the Yogacharya text where this discussion is placed from the Chittamatra or the Yogacharya position. And Kamanashila, in this case, Kamanashila also talked about this, and Rinpoche is commenting now. And so Kamanashila says that the Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning actually is teaching the middle way, free from the two extremes, but from a position of breaking down the way in which various different aspects within the Yogacharya world are free from intrinsic existence. And therefore he considers the sutra to be definitive. So therefore, the argument goes that that within this teaching anyway, within this text, anyway, in contingent entities, those things which arise have an intrinsic characteristic conventionally, but because they have because they're contingent, they're arising from their dependent arisings, they do not have any ultimate characteristic. So Chandrakirti chimes in. This has quite clearly been a complex topic, certainly for me. And he says, and I find much easier to understand, he says, take a snake. A snake is an imaginary construct when we are relating it to when we see it in a rope. When there's a rope in the grass and we see the rope, we think, oh, a snake. That is an imaginary construct. But it's quite real, and it's perfectly real when we conceive it to an actual snake. If we see a snake and say, oh, there's a snake, we're bang on there. So similarly, he says, a nature, and this nature being intrinsic nature, is an imaginary construct when conceived with regard to contingent entities. So everything that is contingent, all dependent arisings, when we think that there's an intrinsic or inherent nature there, then that is an imaginary construct, just like the rope, thinking that the rope is a snake. It's like thinking that this object has an intrinsic nature. However, when a Buddha looks at the cup or whatever, it's correct, sees it correctly as it is in its actual nature. And he says, because of this, if we recognize this relationship for how nature is, or the three natures are, in terms of the imaginary, the non-imaginary, and the real, then we can see that actually the Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning is not a definitive. In other words, we can't use it as a basis for establishing the middle way in terms of the middle way school. So we have these texts, we have these sutras even, which are all trying to establish an understanding of freedom from attachment, grasping onto a nature or selflessness, self. So this topic of selflessness, right? And the way in which the Yogacarya do it, and it does do it, requires building on a series of philosophical assertions and then demonstrating how they don't allow for us to cling on to anything. Whereas the middle way school does not need any philosophical assertions in terms of objects or sort of cosmology at all. The way in which the mind works, for instance, is not present there. Instead, what we do is we demonstrate a lack of any intrinsic existence anywhere. And so there's a different approach. And when we look at people who are trying to work with both, sometimes they get caught with these language boundaries between it. So there's one of the things is generally I feel it especially when we're initially trying to understand emptiness, it's far better to do it from within a single school. And of those schools, I still will hold, as do my teachers, that by far and away the most easy for us to appropriate to recognize and to use as our guide are the teachings of the middle way offered by Chandrakirti. So this is the middle way school, and I'm not alone. I mean, this is not like Ben saying this. There's a huge lineage of teachers behind this approach. But I think personally, I think within the modern world, this is by far and away the most easy for us to recognize. The difficulty of the others is that we're having to buy into some complicated sort of philosophical concepts which really belong to medieval India, and then that makes it much harder for us to interpret medieval philosophy into a modern world. So this is a point, he says, primarily Buddha Palita and Chandrakirti, both middle way scholars, and both who we recognize as being valid in their teachings, both of them say that if something were to exist were anything to exist by way of its intrinsic nature, then it would have to be truly existent. It would have to truly exist in an objective way as it appears. Whereas Bhavaviveka and some others, such as Kamalashila and so on, they say that this alone does not imply that something ultimately exists. So just truly exists and ultimately exists in the same way they say that merely having intrinsic nature doesn't mean that they ultimately exist. And this becomes more complicated because then we have to establish, well, what is it that makes what is it that intrinsic existence gives or is required for it to be established? And that's really, really difficult to see. So once we begin to recognize how intrinsic existence is not present, then it seems to be completely superfluous for anything whatsoever. So then there's a whole sort of discussion about atoms, or what are sort of philosophical atoms, rather. They're not really atoms, they're points. So this goes into quite a bit of science, or sort of early scientific philosophy. But let's follow some of this through. So this is about Chittamarchin's view. They say that individual minute particles are not objects of the sensory consciousness because they don't appear to them. In other words, we can't see an atom, so it's not available, it's not an object of sensory consciousness. And they say that an aggregation of many minute particles, such as all the atoms that make it a cup, is an aggregation of china and other glass and other bits and pieces, is also not an object of the sensory consciousness because it does not substantially exist. So this is really to do with the way, again, we said this is all to do with Chittamatrin, who have their own ideas about how the world is. The Yogacarya has a particular a way in which the world is, and these are some of the aspects of their discussion. And Bhava Viveka responds and saying, if you're saying that a minute particle alone, not in a composite, is not an object of sensory consciousness, you're proving something that everybody agrees, right? And to the latter, he says that if you're saying an aggregate does not exist, because it is not a cause of sensory consciousness, because an aggregate does not substantially exist. Then Bhava Viveka says, oh, okay, I'm happy with that. So here he says they exist. He says, various minute particles of a single type, or, like silica and china or whatever, coalesce and contribute to that aggregation, constituting the parts of an object. And from there arise a mind, from which the image appears, the image of an aggregation of those minute particles. Like, similarly, so pots and such are also substantial existence, because they're composites of minute particles of a single type, or a pot type, I guess. So it's the nature of these atoms. This is going again into sort of medieval science, to be an aggregation of 8 substances. Yet you say that it's I'm a bit confused here. Oh, so anyway, it says here, he says that you explicitly assert that it is substantially existent. Therefore, pots and such, which have natures of being aggregates, are also substantially existent. So a non-aggregate singularity does not exist. So a non-aggregate singularity, which is important here, is the idea of saying something which exists and isn't made up of parts. There is no such thing as a single thing that's not made up of parts. In physics, in modern physics, we will use a point to represent, for instance, a particle. In when we're doing like mathematical modeling of a particle in particle physics, we'll just draw it as a point. It's recognized that that point is not meaning that it is partless or dimensionless, but the idea is essentially it's easier for us to do the mathematics if we consider it that way. So when we're using mathematics, we model things as having a point, but it doesn't mean they really do. This is the way in which we model it, because our model is trying to depict a particular aspect of that. Now, in terms of the very smallest of particles in current standard model, for instance, I'm not saying that this is established by Buddhism at all. This is just our current conventions. We see quarks and so on, and they do not exist independently at all. They exist in a collaborative and or interdependent manner. So in terms of where they are and how fast they're going and so on, all of this is way below Planck length. So these things cannot be determined at all. So these sorts of ideas about when we're talking about the very, very smallest is trying to establish some sort of basis of reality. And what we're seeing is, according to modern science, something that is very, very much in line with the middle way position of saying there's nothing that can be found that is not interdependent, that doesn't arise interdependently, and is not subject to interrelationships. So even then we can talk about a quark as being sort of contingent or existent in a very strongly interdependent manner, and is far from being partless, because it only can be represented within the context that it's placed. And again, it's still merely belongs to the convention of particle physics, you know. And you go to court, and let's say you're caught driving too fast. You go to court and you say, and they say, do you plead guilty or not guilty? And you say, I'm not guilty. And they say, well, why? You know, we've got you on video. And they say, well, because I'm just a bunch of quarks, right? So this thing is like, well, that's not going to rub, it's not going to work. Some people say quarks, I don't know. I'm not really a physicist. So currently this seems to be primarily Rinpoche critiquing some of these points of view from Bhavaviveka's side. Now, why is he doing this? It's not because he's sort of got an axe to grind with Bhavaviveka or what he does. In fact, he recognizes him as a teacher. But it's these sorts of things that we can find ourselves locked into when we're trying to determine our understanding of emptiness. So what he's doing is saying, you know, if he has these issues about whether or not something essentially exists or exists, it essentially exists, its inherent existence is available conventionally, then you need to think twice about it. It's very easy for us to do that. However, and again, Rinpoche probably definitely sees Chandrakirti as being a more reliable source, and Chandrakirti doesn't hold back either in terms of these ideas. And he says that if we think for a moment that we accept in conventional terms what the Sautrantikas hold in terms of the existence of dimensionless particles, for instance, or similar issues in terms of existence, right? Then you're missing the point, completely missing the point. And similarly, he says that if you think that middle way school actually accept in conventional terms what the Vaibhashikas advocate, ultimately you're missing the point. He said, in fact, there are no, the way in which, if we're going to understand it, we've got to get rid of these alternative philosophical underpinnings, which is great for us because it means we don't have to learn them. So, sort of lazy Ben, it's like far better for us to sort of, as I said, when we're establishing it, trying to relate to identifying emptiness, the important thing is if we start thinking that these sorts of philosophical objects are bound within a series of assertions that the middle way school depends upon, then we're going to be missing the point again. So there are some aspects of the middle way school which relates to some aspects of these traditional Buddhist schools, and also even to some Western philosophies. But the purpose and the scope of this is unique, is completely unique. It says within our understanding, we don't even accept conventionally the partless subjects and objects that are found in other schools and in these other schools. So even these Buddhist schools, which are trying to understand emptiness, after all, anatma, selflessness, is built into Buddhism. But these other schools that are establishing anatma, they sometimes might talk about things like partless objects. And it's like, we don't have that. We don't go for them. And it's this idea of partless particles, or yeah, sort of things that non-composed particles. It says, that this is what, when he's talking about Vibhashika or the Svatranika, these are the things he's saying. They talk about these and existing ultimately, and we don't exist. We don't think they exist at all. It says not like we reject everything that they say, but these sorts of objects don't really exist. So, and to be clear, is not even the case that there's a strong negation of these objects. Let's say there were a way in which one could establish them as existing. It doesn't affect the position of middle way school. So it's just that they're not relevant, they're not required, and they don't establish inherent existence. They don't establish objective existence. They don't establish the basis for perception. They don't establish the basis for valid perception. So these sort of things, they're not a part of our understanding. But if they do exist, they exist just like everything else in a conventional manner. They are just conventions. But I'm pretty sure, really, it says when we talk about partless particles, it says they don't exist in the conventional terms. So they are non-existence. So I'm not 100% sure, but I can't imagine really how we would establish, in the middle way school, would establish a partless particle at all, or something that is a non-aggregate, because of this interdependence, and also because of the aspect of recognizing that the way in which we perceive things is always done within a given context. So if you take the context away and you're saying, well, what remains, it's very hard for us then to find anything, and that's the point. So it's like saying, what could you find that actually survives every context? And it's like, well, particles are unlikely to be there. So having said all of this, and again, just to bring us back onto home turf, where I feel a bit more comfortable anyway, is the idea of saying that while it's not while all of this is the case, is interesting. It's not impossible for us to have valid cognitions about this being a cup, for instance, that arises before it even gets to our sort of main thinking. So even within our sense consciousness, we're able to target it. The fact that I know I can reach out and touch it doesn't depend upon my higher cognitive functions. I've got all my senses already doing all that I need to do to enable that. But this ability to establish valid consciousness or valid a valid cognition doesn't depend upon some sort of essential or some essential or inherent existence in terms of either the object or the perception or the underlying mechanisms of that perception. So we can say it's it's not mistaken, but we're not talking about it in terms of intrinsic. We're talking about it in everything else. So then a point is made that I was talking about earlier on, is like saying, well, look, we can understand what you're saying in terms of when we see a reflection of the moon in a lake, and we might think that that's the moon because we can't see the moon. The moon itself is obscured by trees or whatever. And I see the moon and like, oh, look, there's moon there. And oh, no, it's just a reflection of the lake, right? This sort of mind, you say. But you're calling it false and a false perception, and yes, actually it's a legitimate object. It's a legitimate perception in terms of the fact that it's if we recognize it as being a reflection. And it's so when we talk about the referent, in other words, the object itself, like for instance, or the reflection of a face in a mirror, there is no the referent of the perception, in other words, not the perception itself, but the object that appears to be, that we are basing our perception upon, isn't false. And he said, absolutely right. That's completely correct. Just the way in which something appears, the reflection appears, and the way in which the face appears, regardless of whether or not we perceive it as being a legitimate face and the reflection, all of these arise in a way which is in accordance with dependence arising. There's no intrinsic reality established anywhere. So therefore we can see that when we're talking about, and this is where we establish the two truths, so essentially when we're talking about those things that exist in the world that we can recognize conventionally, we can talk about the face, and we can talk about the reflection, and we can talk about the moon, we can talk about the cup, all of these things we can establish, or like the rope in the grass, right? These are all conventionally true. The thinking that the moon is actually in the lake, or thinking that the reflection is a face, or thinking that the rope is a snake, are conventionally false. This is conventional truth. That it's being able to establish whether or not it's true or false within that context, within those conventions. And ultimate truth is recognizing the absence of intrinsic or inherent existence in everything, and that there is the ultimate truth about the final truth, or the end truth, if you like. The deep underlying truth is that this thing that we imagine to be there is not present, in which case our conventional, our grasping onto this existence that we imbue with the objects within our conventions, within our contexts, this is a mistake, this is a falsity, right? So that grasping onto something which isn't present is because we are buying into something which is false, not the objects, the intrinsic nature of the objects. So then the point about saying is in one sense, how do we distinguish them? And Rinpoche says, well, we can see that essentially reflections and forms both appear. It's the same thing, appear in the conventional consciousness. Anybody can recognize that a reflection is, when granny or grandfather is fooled into thinking that they're talking to another person and it's only a reflection. Even the child can laugh and say, you're talking to a reflection, right? So he says, this is absolutely available. So it's not a truth for the world, right? It's quite clearly there's a mistake there. He says, meanwhile, when we recognize when we actually know that it's reflection, or we know that it's a child, or we know that it's a grandmother, then we don't understand the falsity, the false part of that, the false part being that we see or perceive or imagine an intrinsic nature or an inherent nature to those things. And for them, we don't recognize that there is a falsity there. And this is what Chandrakirti is mean by truth for the world, or for a conventional consciousness, or a conventional understanding. Is the part that we do recognize is conventional. The part that we don't see is this final understanding. So therefore, it's completely possible for us to distinguish between true and false. With conventional consciousness, it's completely correct to distinguish between objects as things being inaccurate and accurate in terms of conventional consciousness, without having to bring in any sort of ultimate or any special qualities of existence. So then there's a discussion which I think I might keep to short, about the word conventional. So the conventional word here in Tibetan is kunzob, or sambriti in Sanskrit. Now, one of the problems about that is that the word kunzob or sambriti has two meanings to it. And these two meanings primarily is one which is it's a concealer, something that conceals, and the other one is convention, like we normally use the word. So something that we're familiar with or we can talk about. So the point about essentially is that we're trying to establish, and the argument goes, that because there are two different uses for the word conventional, which one is it we're actually using? Are we talking about it in terms of a convention shared by people, or are we talking about it in terms of concealing something? He says, well, both in one sense. So in terms of the concealer aspect, is we talking about conventional consciousness as seeing the object, but is concealed from it is the fact that the conventional consciousness, the way in which we see something normally, we see it as having this inherent existence on its side. So because of that, we say it's concealed. It's a concealed object, because we are able to relate to the cup fine. We can see the cup, but we imbue upon it this covering of this concealing layer of rhubarb, of intrinsic existence, imagining it is on this side, and that there is concealing its nature of not having that. And then the other one, which is in terms of convention, is in terms of saying that this cup exists within those within a set of conventions. People who recognize cup will see a cup. Those that don't recognize cup won't see a cup. They'll see something else, whatever it is that fits within that convention. You say, well, what do you mean, Ben? There's hardly any convention that doesn't see a cup. Well, it's like saying when we look within an electron microscope, we won't be able to see that much cup. We'll see a very little bit of cup. You imagine yourself as an ant. They don't see a cup. So ants have conventional consciousness. They see the world they don't have any ability to pierce through the nature of their senses, and yet they still are able to see the world too. So the way in which we see the world is very human oriented. It's not necessarily any more or less real than that of the conventions of an ant. Real in terms of experiential. We might know more, but so then, and finally, Rinpoche points out, says that in Chandrakirti he says, whatever is false even conventionally is not a conventional truth. Now, obviously, the point here is being made is essentially when we recognize something as false even conventionally, such as mistaking a snake for a rope, and we say, oh, there's a snake there, it's not a conventional truth, but it belongs to its falsity belongs to conventional truth as a category, right? So it's not saying that it isn't a truth in terms of in terms of conventional terms. It is saying it is, obviously it is false in conventional terms, but therefore it does belong to the terms, but it's not true, needless to say. Okay, and there's possibly quite a difficult session for me. The aspect of some of the ways in which we look at the interplay of Chandrakirti and the Yogacarya school, for instance, gets complex when we're having to learn enough about the scope of the Yogacarya to be able to make sense of what really the crux of the issues are. But apart from that, what we really have been establishing in this is to do with accepting that the way in which we perceive things, the whole aspect of perception in itself, doesn't require any form of specific nature or essence or intrinsic existence in terms of the objects that we engage in, or the way in which we perceive things, or the mechanisms of our perception. So we're primarily going through bit by bit, trying to show that we can close off sort of avenues of thought which would take us into sort of mistaken areas or confused areas, and essentially that's what I believe that this was mainly what this was about, was to establish that we can have a valid cognition. We can talk meaningfully about valid perception, valid cognition, valid arguments, without having to depend upon any form of intrinsic existence as a part of our argument. Okay, so next week is much easier for me, or next session anyway, but that is the end of that one. So let's dedicate any benefits to this to help us uncover and to develop our own insight into selflessness as a part of our path, engaged in the project of working to benefit all beings through relieving from suffering, including ourselves, everybody, especially you. And then let's just sit for a minute or two.